Good morning. Welcome to Convocation. We have two quick announcements before we get started today. Brad?
Yeah. Thanks, Mom. Okay, two things real quick. One, join me for lunch next Saturday, the 12th, on the green. Get your green ticket outside the CAF at lunch today. Also, tailgate cookout next Saturday, the 12th, at 4 o'clock over by the tennis courts, between the parking lot and the tennis courts. This is the food you will get on Saturday. It's good stuff. Be there. Join me. Thank you.
Can you put the Cuba slide, please? So this is a continuation of the Hispanic Heritage Month highlighting different countries. So Cuba has over 200 bays and 250 beaches, so you can't get enough of the sun and sand. Cubans call their island El Cocodrilo, which in Spanish means crocodile, because in the air it looks like a crocodile. So Cuban food is influenced through Spanish, Aboriginal, African, and Caribbean cuisine. It is based on rice, beans, tostones, and all type of beef. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. One quick note and a thank you to all of you. Just wanted to say that we've really appreciated all the thoughtful questions you all have been submitting. We understand we don't always have time to get to all those questions, but I did want to give a shout out specifically last Friday, the Sunitha Millsaps Convo. There were around 30 questions we didn't get to, and they were awesome questions. So we wanted to share those with Sunitha just to let her know what students were thinking, how thoughtful their questions were. We sent her a list of those questions. Sunitha went above and beyond and responded to all of them. So I'm going to share those responses with all of you via email. Please read that email. Please read her responses. They're great. She wanted to engage further with all of you, and I hope you'll take that opportunity. Thank you again. So we'll jump right into it with this morning's convocation. I welcome to the stage Bob Milliman.
Welcome to Honors Convocation. Honors Convocation is an occasion for us to recognize and celebrate the qualities that Bethel lifts up as key values in our educational mission. Qualities and characteristics that are expressed most vividly and meaningfully through your achievements and your actions as students. You embody and enact the Bethel mission. As a reminder, I would like to read the Bethel College mission statement to you. Bethel College prepares students for meaningful lives of work and service through faith formation, the liberal arts, and practical experience in career pathways. In addition to the mission of the college, Bethel includes a religious identity and welcoming statement, which is as equally as important to articulate in this honors convocation today. Here we go. Bethel College is rooted in Christian theology, sustained by Anabaptist distinctives, and guided by Mennonite values. We welcome all people to our campus and prize individuals for their unique personalities, talents, and life experiences. So today, we honor many of you for how your leadership, your unique personalities, your talents, and your life experiences mold and make up our Bethel College community. We are connected to each other, to our local community, and to the world around us. Now, I know that in recognizing some of you, we inevitably miss others who also manifest these qualities in our classrooms, our residence halls, and our playing fields every single day. So I ask that as we recognize these students by name, we also celebrate our collective educational enterprise and our connections to purpose that we share as a learning community. Now, a little exercise. You all received a program as you came in. At least it was available. I'd like you to open up your program. And what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to read the categories, and I will pause briefly as you scan the names there. You can read them a lot faster than I can say them. So first of all, there's the Anti-Oppression Committee, belong to. There's also Community Assistance, the Diversity Council, the Environmental Action Club, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, FEMCOR, Global Ministry Scholarships, International Student Union, the Student Athletic Leaders Team known as SALT, Student Chaplains, the Student Government Association Executive Board, a few more names there, Student Activities Council Coordinators, Service Learning Scholarship, and then a number of students from the sophomore, junior, and senior classes that are recognized for their academic scholarship at this point in their careers. What I'd like to do at this point is ask everybody whose name is listed in this brochure to stand up and let us recognize them with a round of applause. Please stand. During our honors convocation, we also have an address, and today's address is presented by Dr. Siobhan Scarry, Associate Professor of English, who was honored at commencement last spring with the Ralph P. Schrag Distinguished Teaching Award. The Ralph P. Schrag Distinguished Teaching Award recognizes a Bethel faculty member who has made an outstanding contribution to teaching. In presenting this award at commencement, the institution affirms the importance that Bethel College places on excellent teaching by our faculty and meaningful learning by all of you, our students. This year's candidate, or this is from last spring, was chosen by a committee which included the last two recipients of the Ralph P. Schrag Distinguished Teaching Award, as well as the president of Bethel Student Government Association. It was an honor at that time to present to you in a moment the 2019 Ralph P. Schrag Distinguished Teaching Award, which went to Dr. Siobhan Scarry. Associate Professor Scarry earned her MFA, it's Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the University of Montana, and she holds a PhD in English from the State University of New York in Buffalo. Through observation, colleagues comment, and students evaluate in her teaching that Siobhan has been deemed an excellent teacher. For example, one of her colleagues stated, Siobhan has an excellent presence in class and commands strong knowledge for her subject. She is respectful to students and engages them in conversations rather than just spitting out facts. Student comments also give insight into Siobhan's instruction. These comments reveal how valued her teaching is. A student from Critical Writing wrote, this is a beginning level comp course, of course, remarked, "Thank you for teaching this class. I'm not sure whether or not I will be taking additional writing classes in the future, but I leave this class with a higher confidence in my writing skills and tools to succeed in academic writing." Comments from students in upper-level English courses include the following one. Although I'm not always the first to jump into a discussion, I loved hearing the thinking that was happening in minds around the room and hearing so many thoughts about what nature, that's nature with a capital N, is and what that means. The class stretched me, and I'm really grateful for that stretching. It will really affect the way I live my life. Well, that's quite an accolade. And I feel writing is, here's another one, I feel writing is my strong suit because it is a doorway for me to have my voice heard when I otherwise find it difficult to speak. I would take this class again in the future after graduating, even if I was just auditing. Thanks, Siobhan, for the great poetry I got to write this semester. Siobhan's excellence in the classroom is a perfect fit for both her and our students. In her role as an advisor, Dr. Scarry is proactive and positive, always working in the best interest of the student. And as a dedicated liberal education advisor, she epitomizes the engaged student advocate. In addition to her excellent teaching, Siobhan's scholarly work includes the publication of one book, several articles, 2 more books are forthcoming. She has developed a visiting writers series here at Bethel, serves as the advisor for the publication Yelp, and has headed up the creation of a writing and publishing certificate. Bethel College indeed is fortunate to have such a gifted instructor, author, and colleague in our midst. Siobhan, congratulations and thank you for modeling through your teaching the excellence to which we hope all Bethel graduates aspire. And thank you in advance for giving us your address this morning. Let's welcome Dr. Siobhan Scarry.
Thank you, Bob, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the committee for selecting me for the Teaching Award. It's wonderful to work at an institution that values what we do in the classroom. Most of all, thank all of you, Bethel students. I have learned from you so much in my past 5 years in the classroom. I'm getting all verklempt. You've sharpened my thinking, nourished my spirit, and helping you helps me believe in the future. I'm glad you're here today, and thanks in advance for turning off your phones, trying to stay awake, and bearing with me as I now geek out on 20th century American poetry for a bit. I'm going to share a piece of scholarly work with you today, a forthcoming article that centers on poetry and friendship, and which will delve into a very small section of a single poem by the writer Robert Duncan. It's kind of the world in a grain of sand kind of talk. I hope to give you a window into scholarly research in the field of English, in this case archival research, as well as offer some larger framing thoughts about what the friendship between poet Robert Duncan and his college friend Mary Fabili may teach us, or at least offer us to think about living in a polarized time. There we go. Here they are in California around, I thought that would happen. Sorry. Here they are together in California around 1940. Fabili and Duncan became friends while attending UC Berkeley in the 30s. Fabili is on the left. No one has yet figured out who the woman in the middle is. I've asked everybody at the archive and Duncan scholars, we can't figure it out. And there's Duncan on the right, reading from a book of poetry. This snapshot is probably not so different from one that you might find 50 years from now of you and your mod mates. Okay, you probably won't have a record player in the background like they do, but you know what I mean. Pictures of just hanging out, being together, belonging. 50 years is how long Duncan and Fabili kept alive their friendship, and it wasn't always an easy one, as you'll soon see. Who will you still be friends with from your time here in 50 years? What will happen to friendships if life takes you or your friend down very different paths? What if your beliefs, convictions, or identity shift over time and your friend doesn't shift in these same ways? Will you split or drift or still feel a tug that binds you together? This talk will make a whole lot more sense if I give you a little bit of context about Robert Duncan and how this forthcoming article came to be. I became interested in Robert Duncan's poetry the moment I first read his work. His poems are beautiful, difficult, and always worth the efforts of close reading. Duncan was a hugely influential member of the San Francisco Renaissance, a flourishing of innovative writing and artistic production in the Bay Area after World War II. He was a vocal anti-war activist and thinker. He was a conscientious objector in World War II, an activist both on and off the page during the 1960s anti-war movement, and one of the first to publish a political tract that made an explicit call for gay rights as a matter of social justice. His 1944 essay, think about that, is a seminal text in the history of gay and lesbian rights. In 1951, he and the painter Jess Collins fell in love, and the two remained together until Duncan's death in 1988. Jess, as he came to be known in the art world by a single name, like people like Madonna, you know, they just choose one name. He came to be known for his collage work pictured here, as well as more traditional oil paintings. This one is a famous one that he painted of Duncan in their San Francisco home that they shared together. One of the more intriguing elements of Duncan's work is his ability to create texts that are something like a chorus. where his own poetic voice is woven into a textual fabric that includes allusions to other texts, quotations from poets and philosophers, even translation work. Duncan himself delights in calling his work derivative, a word that often carries the negative connotation of unoriginal, but he didn't really believe in the single author or about, holding up the poet as something special. He really believed that we were all a product of many people. So with Duncan, it's actually his unique ability to weave so many derivations into his work, quotations and allusions and that kind of thing, that makes his work so distinctive. My own scholarly work on Duncan began as an attempt to trace the derivations, you know what that word means now, right? Into one of his poems, a 3-part serial poem called Night Scenes from his 1964 collection, Roots and Branches. This meant countless hours in the SUNY Buffalo archive, pictured here, which houses Duncan's full collection of papers, drafts, and letters. The curator took this picture for me a couple days ago. I said, "Can you take a picture of the Duncan archive?" And he said, "No, I can't get that into the frame of my camera, but I'll just take a snapshot of some of the boxes." So this is a fraction of the Duncan archive. And you might be interested to know that they also have Duncan's piano, some paintings by Jess, some household items. It's really a fascinating collection. My time in the archive led to many exciting discoveries, and the work culminated, or so I thought, in a long article which was published in the scholarly book, pictured here, called Reading Duncan Reading, a collection of writings all about Duncan and his practice of derivation. But I hadn't been able, in the longer article, to incorporate some of the remarkable letters between Duncan and his friend Mary Fabili, which were so important to Duncan's composition of part 1 of the poem, and are arguably interesting in their own right. I also had the opportunity to interview Fabili in 2008. She was 94 years old and living in the same bungalow in Berkeley that she'd lived in since World War II. I was particularly interested in interviewing her because biographers of Duncan seem to have just castigated her for being a Catholic dogmatist, and they said the friendship fell away, and they made her very unimportant in the story. And the more I read the letters between the two of them, the more I realized how vital their friendship was to both of them, and there was more to the story. So in the shorter piece, which I'm sharing with you today, I focus exclusively on the friendship between Duncan and Fabili, and the constellation of texts that illuminate not only the complexity of their friendship, but also what was at stake for Duncan when he composed part 1 of the poem Night Scenes. Fun fact, aside from about 12 fellow Duncan scholars with whom I shared some of this material, you'll be the first to see these primary texts from the archive. The poem Night Scenes, which the archive notebooks make clear Duncan composes between 1957 and 1960, contains 3 sections, each of which foreground in various ways the longing of a speaker to feel unproblematic joy in his desire and to live free of religious judgment. It's a bold poem for the 1950s. This is pre-Stonewall, pre-gay rights movement, still at a time when the American Psychiatric Association lists homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disorder. Parts 2 and 3 of the poem, which Duncan writes first, are celebratory. And Duncan, interestingly, he writes these first, the celebratory parts. But part 1, written last, and excerpted here. And this is the discovery that I made in the archive, that this section falls fast on the heels of a disagreement about religion and homosexuality with his friend Mary Fabili. It sets the poem as a whole within the greater societal context of the treacherous conditions of terror, surveillance, and police brutality, the very real and material conditions for gay Americans at the mid-century. I'm just going to read the last 2 stanzas, as we'll be returning to these later. Our nerves respond to the police cars cruising, a part of the old divine threat. How in each time the design is still moving, the city roars and is a lion, but it is a deep element, a treacherous leviathan. The moon climbs the scale of souls, oh, to release the first music somewhere again, for a moment to touch the design of the first melody. Duncan sets an urban scene here shot through with fear, but the last stanza also holds some kind of hope. Hold that in your mind, if you will, as we now turn to the correspondence with Fabili that inaugurated this part of the poem. As I mentioned, the two met in Cal in the 1930s when they were undergrads. Their correspondence began when Duncan moved to New York in 1938, continued upon his return to the Bay Area in the mid-40s, and would last in some fashion until the end of Duncan's life. Even though Duncan and Jess were in San Francisco and Fabili was in Berkeley, the Bay Bridge can be a real barrier to getting together, and having lived there for 10 years, I can attest that that's true. It feels like another country, the East Bay, sometimes. So they actually wrote letters to each other even when they just lived a few miles apart. Reading through 50 years of their letters was fascinating. They often gave each other tangible support, commenting on each other's poems, adding their labor to each other's first major publications. Fabili, who worked as a visual artist as well as a writer, after she graduated, she became the curator of the Oakland Museum for something like 20 years. She's responsible for the drawings in Duncan's first book in 1947 called Heavenly City, Earthly City. And when Fabili published her first book of poems in 1968, and you might want to note that date because it's well after they have a huge disagreement, he still helps her get her book published. It was largely through the efforts of Duncan and his work with a small press called Berkeley Miscellany Editions that made it happen. As the letters reveal, their friendship offered intangible gifts as well. You probably can't read that, but I just wanted you to sense the intimacy of the handwritten letters from 1949. In this excerpt from a 1949 letter, Fabili acknowledges the depth of Duncan's impact on her life. Up here is the 6th and last page of the letter, and I'll just read an excerpt from this page. I know you pray for me in your own way, in your friendship, which has meant so much to me in the course of many years. If I have come to the discovery of God, it is because you have also helped me. Through your aspirations, your poetry, your love of life and the human, you have overlooked my stupidity and my arrogance too many times for me to not be aware. And when you have not overlooked them, you have done me a great service. How much better I understand you than I did before. And through this understanding, I learned to have love and sympathy for Jerry and Spicer and many others. You have helped me to unlock the doors of my heart that I might learn to love many people. It is wonderful to me that God teaches us in a multitude of ways and by the most diverse and contradictory of means. The reference is there to Jerry. That's Jerry Ackerman, a boyfriend of Duncan's at the time in the 40s. And Spicer is the famous poet Jack Spicer, who was also gay. When Fabili and Duncan first struck up their friendship in the 1930s, she was agnostic. But at the time of this letter, she had already begun the process of returning to the Catholic faith of her childhood, a transformation that remained of central importance right up until her death in 2011. And when I interviewed her in 2008, she could no longer walk. She was 94, but she had the priest come to her house to give her the sacraments. So she was still a practicing Catholic, even at 94, when she couldn't get out of the house. That she credits Duncan in this letter as a help to her growing faith, and that she is grateful for the compassion he has brought forth in her toward their mutual gay acquaintances, reads as bittersweet, given that it is precisely these two topics, religion and homosexuality, that will wrench the correspondence 10 years later. Throughout the 1950s, the relationship is not without incident. After Duncan and Jess moved in together, Fabili sent them numerous letters inviting them to come to Mass with her in Berkeley, which they never did. And Duncan visited Fabili at her home to ask if she would illustrate his book called Medieval Scenes, and she refused. Fabili told me about this incident when I interviewed her. She said that she told Duncan she found the book anti-Catholic and anti-women, and that she would not illustrate it for him, and he apparently grabbed his papers and left her house in a big huff. In September of 1958, Fabili sent Duncan a 2-page single-spaced letter, a short excerpt of which I'm going to show you here. That's not it. That's Fabili, right around the 1950s. There we go. And I'm offering this letter. There's so many that I could share with you, but I'm offering just this little excerpt as a way to give you a sense of her depth of feeling for Duncan. Dear Robert, it's the strangest thing, but I think about you quite a bit these days. Sometimes, when I'm walking up toward home, I will look up at the Berkeley hills and this clear golden weather we're having, and remember how we used to sit on the campus lawns and talk and almost see our souls. You might not see the word almost there. She actually wrote that in the margin, and it got cut off here. And lines from your poems often come to mind. I listen in the shade to the one I love, and many other lines too. I realize now that you are more real to me than so many others I thought were part of me. They left clean breaks with just a little scar left, but you haven't broken off. You are still here, or I am still with you, who knows? Sometimes when I am cooking, I think of you, and then I am also reminded of the times you invited me for dinner. Once we had beef heart. You were so proud of it, I made myself eat some and like it, an ordeal one undergoes only for a dear friend, a friend as dear as oneself. In the spring of 1959, just a year later, Duncan sent Fabili his then recent book, which was called Letters Poems, and as was custom between them, asked for comments. The letter that Fabili sent back, dated May 17th of 1959, set into motion a veritable firestorm of letters and other writings, all of which led to Duncan's composition of part 1 of Night Scenes. I won't read the full letter here, but there it is. I'll point out that in the first few paragraphs, she's quite hard on Duncan's work, a bit more so than usual, suggesting that he's stagnating as a writer, and then kind of joking, not joking. You know what that feels like, right? She's joking, not joking, that she might burn the book except for one poem, which she thinks is perfect. It's this passage, however, in the middle of the letter, that upset Duncan a good deal. The affection between us has survived somehow. I suppose it's partly because I pray for you, and partly because you rely on me to pray for the salvation of your soul. But you have to want to be saved. You have to cooperate with God's grace. If I manage to get to heaven and find you have gone to hell, I will sing Alleluia just the same. So don't be delaying things too long, and don't give way to human respect. And for heaven's sake, pray, pray, pray that God help and save you and change you. Duncan fairly reels from this letter. Over the course of the next few weeks, his correspondence with Fabili becomes an almost daily occurrence. He writes and then discards an angry poem in which he quotes from Fabili's letter directly, and part 1 of Night Scenes, which I projected on the earlier slide, emerges in the notebooks. And I should just mention Duncan's compositional practice. He writes longhand in these notebooks, and you can do a genetic history of every poem, which is really difficult for most scholars to be able to do. Genetic history is when you can actually look at all the drafts that come before the final version and figure out what was in draft 3, what was in draft 4, what got changed. You can do the full genetic history of each poem. Duncan's initial poetic response is an angry poem that he writes on the very day Fabili's letter arrives in the mail. In Perplexity, which has remained unpublished until now, and maybe Duncan's mad at me for publishing it in my article, who knows? Sorry, Duncan. Provides a raw look into Duncan's thinking on religion, orthodoxy, homosexuality, and in the last stanza in particular, which is the second kind of row there, his own rejoinder to Fabili's concerns. On the slide is just the first and last stanzas, because it's quite a long poem. But you can get the gist of his tone here. You can see on the left he's quoting from her letter, right? She writes, pray, pray, pray that God help and save you and change you. He's quoting that part that he finds so difficult to digest. But I'll read the last stanza because that's what's going to come up later in the talk. But in this imaginary other kingdom whereof I speak, the name of love includes even such hell-blasted souls as mine, for they are notes in a sort of all-summoning scale where no man is excluded from its harmony. Blasting Yahweh along with Pan and this old friend who threatens me are parts in a designing heart and mind of the music that sets the cosmos free, and in the place of all we bless and damn, bringeth whole a joyous Adam. That this poem responds so directly to the interpersonal crisis and Duncan's feelings of being threatened by Fabili gives this poem a particular kind of force. But it's precisely this quality of direct and unworked through reaction that causes Duncan to ultimately shelve the poem. And again, I wonder if he might be mad at me for showing it all to you and to other people. About a week after its composition, he sends this poem to his poet friend Denise Levertov, and some of you might know her name. She steers him away from what she calls its tone of anger or indignance. She feels this mars the work, but she also directs Duncan's attention to this last stanza as material capable of lasting value. Here is the kernel of Levertov's assessment of In Perplexity, sent to Duncan in a letter on May 25th, 1959. The May 17th to July was just packed with letters all about this whole situation. Here's what Levertov says. The poem doesn't seem fully alive in its own right. It is still too much attached to your immediate feelings on receiving someone's letter, so that though the last stanza is so beautiful, the rest of the poem puts me in mind of the long, indignant, protesting, or scornful letters I have often written in response to some criticism, but next day have thrown out. Yet there's so much substance there. I would hate to see the poem rejected by you, yet I don't feel it is a free thing as it stands. Levertov offers even greater candor in a second letter, telling Duncan, a little bit more personally, that the poem, quote, doesn't seem up to you, perhaps. Part 1 of Night Scenes follows hard upon these missives, emerging as a draft in his notebook a few days later. In July, after Duncan has written Part 1 of Night Scenes and discarded In Perplexity, he writes to tell Levertov that he himself has reevaluated the poem as participating in a kind of gratuitous protest that ultimately, quote, avoids roots and feelings, substituting attitudes and hysteria. So I'm going to put, for my last slide, these two closing stanzas up side by side, the ending of In Perplexity and the ending of the Part 1 of Night Scenes. So I'm putting these up to look at them as a kind of comparison and to share with you my contention that the ending of In Perplexity and Levertov's talk to him about how it was worthy of something, but the whole poem wasn't free as it stood, is a rehearsal for his writing the ending part of Part 1 of Night Scenes. In other words, the poem that does get published is kind of a revision of this first one. Part 1 of Night Scenes ends by broadening its gaze from the interpersonal and reactive quality of In Perplexity to take up the broader social context and actual material conditions of those whom Duncan in the earlier poem calls such hell-blasted souls as mine. Set in the very real world of New York in the 1940s and 50s, Duncan reveals more than a singular experience of someone whose old friend threatens him. The threat posed by one friend in the first poem is figured here in Night Scenes as the menacing panopticon of the larger society, police cars cruising, which are part of the old divine threat, even the city itself which roars and is a lion. In the closing stanza of In Perplexity, Duncan offers a kind of utopic vision of a place in which even hell-blasted souls are notes in a sort of all-summoning scale where no man is excluded from its harmony. In the final stanzas here in Night Scenes, this all-summoning or all-included scale and its music are revisited. But here, Duncan tempers his vision, given the full context of the societal parameters. You might remember that the poem started with the moon, said the moon uprising goes down the street, down the avenue, something like that. So it's about this kind of the moon shining within a city. And here at the end, the moon, whose light first draws the reader's eye into the traffic and lights of the city, returns in the final portion of the poem as a natural force among the material and social realities of police cars and terror-filled hearts. Its light moves democratically as it climbs the scale of souls, but given the real forces that press in, the music of this scale is not a certainty, but rather something longed for. In the final lines of Part 1, Duncan uses the heightened voicing of apostrophe. That's that moment when you see the big O to release the first music, to reassert the vision of an inclusive music and harmony, which I read as a kind of spiritual oneness in which he is welcome, but also to measure the distance between the vision and its realities, which includes threats of arrest and violence. Duncan effectively transforms the substance that Levertov recognizes as holding promise in the final stanza of In Perplexity into a poem that no longer relies on indignation, generally not a good place to write a poem from, but rather uses the crisis in friendship to power a poem of broader concerns. When I interviewed Mary Fabili in 2008, she told me that she and Duncan should both be held accountable for their disagreements. We were like brother and sister, you know, she said. It was the kind of relationship where we wanted each other to be the way that we were. I thought since I was being converted, and because he liked a lot to do with Catholicism, he should be converted too. He, on the other hand, thought I should accept whatever he wrote. Taking each other to task seemed to be an integral part of their friendship, and it's not surprising that their friendship lost some footing, given the irreconcilable nature of their differences. But when critic Eckbert Foss characterizes their friendship in Duncan's biography as having drifted away due to Mary's Catholic dogmatism, what is lost in the history is the passionate way that each of them engaged, Duncan especially in his poems, with this very substance, as Levertov called it, of their disagreements. Fabili remained, in her own fashion, committed to her friendship with Duncan until the end, sending him poetry, well wishes, and continued nudges about the Catholic faith. 2 weeks before Duncan passed away, they spoke by phone. We had a very good conversation, like in the old days, she remembers. He was always saying something funny and amusing. After Duncan passed away, Fabili had a mass said for him. Duncan, for his part, helped Fabili to publish her book, Aurora Bly, and early poems, despite the conflicts between them, and remained connected through letters over the years. One of the most moving texts I discovered in the archive is what appears to be an unsent letter from Duncan to Fabili in the 1950s, and this is one of those crazy discoveries. It was like tucked in between two pieces of paper, and the curators didn't know it was there, and it was really an exciting day. Duncan explains, as he does in Perplexity, that his love for the goods of this world will keep him separate from that fold Fabili is so anxious for him to join. I am not of the kingdom, he writes, but of that world which you must deny in order to embrace Christ. But Duncan also finds a way, through his own particular vision, to maintain his connection with Fabili. He writes, since the search for faith, the living in God, is human being, I am as ever devoted to you. It is this, the many forms of human being, that commands all my devotion where I am capable of devotion. What Fabili admires in Duncan early on in their friendship, his love of life of the human, and as she tells him in her heartfelt letter in the 40s, is precisely what keeps Fabili in Duncan's fold. And it's this inclusive vision that he brings to the texts that emerge out of the crisis in their friendship. This is maybe not a friendship to look to if you're searching for a perfect model of working through differences. Duncan and Fabili did not come to any kind of compromise or convince each other to change in any way. A reasonable person could argue that Duncan should have cut ties with Fabili. Maybe she was homophobic and unaccepting. And I think a reasonable person could argue that Fabili should have cut ties with Duncan. Her religion told her that Duncan was going to hell, and he didn't seem to be open to her many attempts to help him. These are perspectives that reasonable people could take. But what I find remarkable is that the unreason of their devotion to each other as people won out. They stayed in dialogue, even when they didn't move forward an inch on core topics like religion and homosexuality that vexed them. They took breathers from one another, but never breaks. And for Duncan, the energies of discord were artistically productive. The first part of Duncan's poem, Night Scenes, is a testament to art's ability to digest anger, petulance, and personal effrontery, all the emotions that Duncan poured into his original poem in Perplexity, and turn those energies into a powerful social document that speaks to the conditions of gay Americans who lived under surveillance and attack from the institutions designed to protect the country's citizens. Perhaps sometime over the next 50 years, as your friendships shift and change, or as you yourself transform through time, you'll remember how these two stayed devoted through difference. Perhaps you'll have a moment in a friendship when you want to break, and maybe you'll remember that you can take a breather. Vent in your journal or to your friend Denise, but don't broadcast or publish the anger. Do something productive with those energies. And like Duncan and Fabili, perhaps you'll be able to follow the unreason of devotion that keep us all within the fold of human community. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. We have some time for questions. You may submit your questions electronically, or I will look for hands around the room for questions for Siobhan.
Hi. This is really fascinating to me, and I'm definitely going to be asking you more about this later on our own time, but how did you get into studying this particular poet and this particular facet of his life? Like, what led you to even finding this stuff?
So Robert Duncan is a mid-century poet, and I was, generally speaking, in my PhD program, pretty interested in poets from the 30s to the 70s. The fact that SUNY Buffalo, where I got my PhD, has this incredible Duncan archive makes of many SUNY Buffalo PhDs Duncan scholars, because the archive is right there. And it snows a lot in Buffalo, and I just sat in that archive and I just said, oh, there's a box with letters to this person. Who's that person? Okay, I'll read those letters. Now I'm hungry. I'm going to go eat something. I'll come back and spend 4 more hours and figure out some more letters. It's a breadcrumb trail, and you just kind of follow it. And I would say that a lot of my discoveries were surprises and just happened because I put in the time. I was following the genetic history of this 3-part poem, and so I was noting the dates of when certain things were getting written. And then I just bumped into this Fabili box and figured out, oh, wait a minute. Part 1 is written way later than all the other parts of this poem, and it happens like exactly when he and Fabili are having this big crisis. So I kind of put 2 and 2 together.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you show the first picture again? I think it's really beautiful.
This one? No. Oh, one of the paintings? That one? Mm-hmm. The Jess Collins has, he's passed on now, but he has a website with, you can see a lot of his work if you look him up, Jess Collins.
What particularly about poetry from the 1930s to the 1970s do you like? Like what brings you to there of all times?
Well, I'm a contemporary poet, and I think you start to realize that in order to really understand anything about what you're doing, you have to go back 100 years. And then honestly, then if you really want to understand that, you have to go back another 100 years, So I wanted to know what the heck I was doing on the page, and so I went back 100 years and started getting interested in the Modernists and some of the innovations that poets coming out of the 19th century were enacting. It was a really exciting time for poetry in which lots of different poets were experimenting on the page in lots of different ways, and poetry was no longer, the expectations for what you'd find when you went to a poem started to really change, and you really didn't know what you were gonna see when you opened the book. So I found that really invigorating, and I wanted to understand maybe what parts of that tradition I was writing from, but maybe didn't know about. You're always connected to a tradition, even if you don't know it, so I wanted to figure out what I was doing.
Take one from electronic submissions.
One of the questions was, you mentioned excitement at finding the hidden excerpt. What were some other exciting finds?
Like the fact that Duncan owed Spicer like $7 for groceries. And, when you read someone's notebooks, I mean, it's just plain old gonzo weird, right? He's got like a poem mixed in with a grocery list with a reminder to pay someone back for something. And when I read the Fabili letters, I just loved getting to know her. I mean, by the time I went to her house in Berkeley, I just felt like I had already met her because I'd read so many letters from her. Working in the archive is really exciting because you just get a sense of the human heartbeat.
Could you talk about the process of securing that interview with her? I know that we have a number of students involved in a number of different qualitative research projects throughout this semester. Could you speak a bit about some things that you did?
Yeah, I don't know if that's going to be so helpful to other students because through the archive, I figured out her address, her return address, because it was on all the envelopes. And then I Googled it and figured out she was still living there. And then I looked up in the white pages online the phone number. And then I had the curator at Buffalo who was still receiving Christmas cards from her because they had asked if she would provide her letters from Duncan to the Duncan Archive. And she had said yes, so she felt a connection to the archive. I had him write her a postcard asking if it was okay for me to call her. And once I knew that postcard had reached her, I knew that I was a little prepped for the phone call, and so I called and asked her. And we spent an hour and a half together, and She had me go into her bedroom and get out all of her drafts of poems that she had been working on since the 70s. It was an incredible afternoon. And she lived to 97. Yeah. She was reading the Gulag Archipelago when I got to her house. Does anyone know that book? It's like this big. She's an incredible person, yeah.
How were all the letters and poetry found? Did someone keep them, or were they retrieved?
That's a good question. So Duncan was a believer in process. He was a poet of process, not product. So some poets might not save, their rough drafts, but Duncan really believed that good work crouched in bad work, and that the revising process was something that would, that you might want to go back to work that wasn't doing so well in order to pull out some good ideas. So he saved everything, and I mean, I can imagine that the archivists at Buffalo are quite pleased when they figured out the size of that archive. Not all poets' archives are that big. And of course, he and Jess were very involved in the intellectual community in San Francisco, and the paintings and Jess's books and their piano, which Jess painted. It's a fascinating archive. Even the ephemera is interesting.
Do we have one more question?
That's a great question. I prepared for that interview as best I could, and it went all kinds of sideways. And I just went with it. And I recorded it so that I could make sure I knew what the heck had happened during that hour, I made sure I was really clear on the chronology of the letters, and I made sure I was really clear about the two nuggets I wanted to get out of that time with her. I knew she was 94. I didn't know how lucid she would be. She was incredibly lucid. But she was hard of hearing, and she did sometimes talk over me and not totally answer what I'd asked. So, sometimes I'd ask something and she'd answer a different question, or she'd say, "Can you write that down?" And then that would take a long time. And so it didn't go in any sort of direct way. It was very meandering. But I just made sure I was clear about the two things I really wanted to try to understand. And I also let it go where it went. We called her sister at one point, who was like 92, who had known Duncan as well, and we had a kind of wide-ranging conversation with her. It was really interesting. But I think, people who say yes to an interview and who have been connected like this to a poetic community like the San Francisco Renaissance, they have things to tell you that you might not know you should ask. And so I tried to be receptive to what she wanted to talk about as well. Asking someone to talk about conflict, they don't always want to go right there. So.
Let's have one more round of applause for Siobhan and for all of you. Thank you very much for being with us today. Enjoy your lunch.